So one of the things, like I said, I've been doing these presentations for about 11 years now. And one of the things that people always ask me to do is to talk about myths and misconceptions that occur with autism. Um, so finally, after years of procrastinating, I decided, you know what, why not? Um, let's do a slide talking about Mythbusters. So for those of you who are familiar with the show that appeared on Science Channel, gosh, it's been a while since it appeared, with Adam Savage and Jamie Hyneman. What they would do is they would take myths that appear in society, weird news articles, things that just don't seem like it's possible for them to happen, and talk about them. So what they would do is test these myths scientifically and put them into three categories: busted, plausible, and confirmed. Busted myths were the ones that pretty much can never happen no matter what you try doing. And a lot of times the busted myths ended up with putting a whole bunch of C4 into something and blowing it up, just to have fun with it. Plausible myths could happen under the right circumstances. One of the most famous ones that they did that ended up being plausible was the Alcatraz escape, where 3 prisoners supposedly escaped from the maximum security prison in San Francisco, Alcatraz Island, and made it to shore to live productive lives afterwards. It was plausible that they could have, if all the right criteria went in place. Confirmed myths are ones that they're going to happen with reasonable chances of them occurring. So let's talk about these myths in relationship to autism. First of all, that is a picture of Albert Einstein. Fun fact, Albert Einstein actually did have autism. That's not what I'm busting here. What I am busting here is that there's a misconception out there that everyone with autism is a bona fide genius. I hate to say it, I don't like putting it this way, but not everyone with autism is a genius. I'm very disappointed about that too. I really wish I was a genius. Really do. It's not how that works. A lot of where this myth comes from is pop culture. So, Einstein is everywhere in pop culture. It's a household name, and he is synonymous with extremely intelligent. If any of you are Big Bang Theory fans, Sheldon Cooper is a character based off of, and Jim Parsons, the actor who plays Sheldon Cooper, actually looked at and watched film footage of kids with autism to try and put on that character. So he would imitate the tics and awkwardness that people with autism have. Another example, The Good Doctor. These 3 examples are examples of savants. They are examples of one extreme of autism. There's a whole other extreme, which we call low-functioning autism, which these individuals are still very intelligent. They just, they're nonverbal, so they have no way to express that level of intelligence, say for an IQ test, to prove that they are quote-unquote intelligent. Next, vaccines. This is a very controversial issue. It is one that I err on the side of scientific data. Science says that vaccines and the chemicals in them do not cause autism. There was one study published back in the 90s that made a connection between the mumps, measles, rubella vaccine and autism. The guy who published that study has been completely disavowed, lost all scientific credibility, because he actually had to defend himself in court, and his defense was that he indeed published a fake study for money and for notoriety. Any connection between vaccines and autism is false, or at least not there in any of the scientific data. Kids are just as likely to develop autism whether they are vaccinated or not, because it is, at its core, a genetic issue. Next. That's a cute little happy Android robot. And I think as I'm going through this, I'm trying to do a half-decent job of showing emotion and being happy to see all of you and enjoying what I'm doing. What I mean by that is there's a misconception out there that people with autism are emotionless little robots. I mean, I'd love to be the kind of teacher that, kids don't associate with the electrical outlet in the broom closet that we plug in at the end of the day. I know I've had quite a few professors and teachers who, I wonder when their battery is going to run out. My goal with my students is to be as animated and as fun as possible. I actually had to write a philosophy of education, and in there I said, kids have to go to school. They do not need to suffer through an unending existence of boredom. So I'm trying to be as non-boring as possible. Let's move on to the plausible myths. That's a volcano, which we really don't need any of right now. We've got enough going on in the world as it is. Just keep the volcanoes at bay. If you can try and control that, if any of you have powers to control volcanoes, make them just stay cool for now, please. What the volcano symbolizes is a meltdown. So meltdowns, as I say, come in two flavors. And what a meltdown is, it's a survival response to stress. It's a fight or flight response. So what that is, it's our survival response. If you believe your life is in immediate danger, you are hardwired to do one of two things. You can fight, or you can flee the scene. Either way, the goal is to get out of that environment, whether by neutralizing all of the enemies around you, or by just turning tail and running the other direction. But that also goes for meltdowns, because meltdowns are just an extension of that survival response. So in this case, only having one type of meltdown, only having the explosive type of meltdown, doesn't really do what a meltdown is justice. There can also be a meltdown where a person with autism will just shrink into a little ball and just imagine that things around them aren't there anymore. And that's where evolution went a little haywire, in my opinion. Because our two responses to being surrounded by 100 bloodthirsty ninjas are to fight our way out with no martial arts training whatsoever, or curling up into a little ball and pretending the ninjas just aren't there anymore. Charles Darwin, can you answer how that happened, please? Never mind, we'll move on. Next, that poor woman is having a migraine, which I sincerely hope I'm not giving to any of you. And a migraine is a perfect analogy for what a sensory overload is. So sensory overload is something that people with autism have to deal with. And it's caused by a heightening of one or more of the five senses. In my case, I'm hypersensitive to touch, and I'm hypersensitive to sound. So being isolated in my bedroom where there is no one else but me, and no one is allowed to touch anyone anymore, this is really nice for me. Like, I could get used to this. There's no sounds, there's nothing. I don't have to worry about loud, obnoxious screaming of children. I also don't have to worry about the unexpected child running up behind me and grabbing my legs and pulling me down to the ground. Yes, that has happened. Preschoolers are interesting. Don't go there if you don't like kids. But this is what sensory overload is. So it's instantaneous pain. It is quite literally your brain is not sure what to do with all this information, and it's exploding inside your head. My high school cafeteria had 400 people, give or take, per lunch period. I could hear every single conversation going on in that room, regardless of where I was sitting. And it was a lot to take in. Imagine the most crowded place you've ever been in, and being able to hear everyone, being able to hear every single thing everyone says and process it. It's a lot. It's scary. It's frightening. It's painful. And that's what I and other people with autism deal with on a daily basis. Now, the reason this is in the plausible category is because, like with everything else, there's another side to this coin. So you have people who have hypersensitivity, but then because the body likes to adjust whenever it heightens one thing, this also means you have hyposensitivity to some of the other senses. So in my case, my sense of smell and taste are just crap. Like, I don't really taste much of a difference in things, which is really weird. Also, if you can tell by these gigantic things on my face, my sense of sight has also been compromised because touch and hearing are so far heightened. Moving on to the next one. So sort of on the same line, there's a misconception that people with autism do not like hugs. And that's true for some people. I fall into that category. I am not a huggy, touchy, feely kind of guy. Especially if you look like that thing. Like, if you are that shade of yellow, if, like, those aren't eyes, it's not a mouth. If you're that shade of yellow, please leave this call and go to a doctor, because there is something seriously wrong with you that you should probably get checked out, like, immediately. But anyway, some people with autism actually do enjoy the feeling of a hug, of a warm embrace. This is why things like weighted blankets work really, really well with trying to calm down a child who's having a meltdown. It's kind of funny. Totally unethical to do, but it's kind of funny. If you have a child who uses a weighted blanket and they're going into a meltdown, just put the weighted blanket on them and watch them calm down. Then take it off and they start freaking out again, then put it back on, then take it off, then put it back on. And congratulations, you've now succeeded in torturing a poor defenseless child. Yay. Believe me, these are not all jokes. These are all jokes meant to be completely and totally facetious. I would never do this to any kids, just as a disclaimer. All right, confirmed. No one in Pink Floyd had autism, as far as I know. What this is a spectrum. It's showing light going in one side of a prism and a whole rainbow coming out the other side. It's very pretty. It's very nice. A rainbow and a spectrum is also what we consider autism to be. It is a wide range of disorders, going from, like I said before, on one end, lower functioning autism spectrum disorders, which generally the symptoms of that are nonverbal, lots of repetitive motions, repetitive behaviors, very, very, very lower adaptive skills. So like hygiene, toileting, feeding, things like that. They will need a lot of extra support in those areas. But what's interesting is, intelligence-wise, they're about the same as kids with high-functioning autism. The functioning part here for high-functioning autism is that I have the ability to talk. I can do most of the adaptive behaviors that I just described. And with that, I look, I sound, I act relatively normal. So there are parts of having low-functioning autism that are kind of advantageous. I don't want to say it's easier to see a kid with lower functioning autism, but people are more willing to run over and help out when they're kids. Now, as an adult, the script flips a little bit. But for me as a kid, if I were to have a meltdown because I walked into Walmart and it was way too loud, people would judge my parents and ask them, why, or, just look at them and ask in their heads, like, why can't you control your kid? He is way too old to be doing that. And it's something that is hard for my parents. Now, as I've gotten older, I've become able to control the meltdowns a little more, and they aren't physical as they used to be. But now I've become more socially acceptable, where behaviors displayed by people with lower functioning autism may not be as socially acceptable, which is an interesting paradigm shift, just going from being a kid to being an adult. It's very sad in a way. So if you take nothing else away from this presentation, take a message of acceptance with you. Just accept people for who they are. Don't judge. Just accept. Next one. For any of you involved in education or who are currently students, you are very familiar with this acronym. It's also missing a letter right now. So we have STEM education, or right now it's STEAM education: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. For whatever reason, people with autism have heightened abilities in these areas: science, technology, engineering, arts, and math. Scientists have no idea why. Now, if you look at what I'm capable of doing, especially with art, forget it. I can do stick figures. That's the extent of it. It's just, no. The reason there's a $sign there in place of the S in STEM is not because STEAM and STEM education are very expensive, which they can be, but because people with autism are generally kind of expensive. Estimates are between birth and 18 years old. The average cost of a person with autism is $1 million for like non-basic needs, for being able to take care of them. Now, not all of this money is spent from out of pocket. A lot of it comes from insurance, a lot of it comes from government assistance programs, but no matter where it comes from, $1 million is still $1 million. By the time I die, that cost will be closer to $5 million, which is part of the reason why autism isn't as well funded as some of the other disabilities out there. So number one, autism isn't exactly directly life-threatening. Like, I would rather have more funding in cancer research, absolutely, than autism, but at the same time, autism is the fastest growing developmental disability and the least funded because it's so expensive and so time-consuming to care for a person with autism. And lastly, as I've said, autism is genetic. In fact, through a long-term research project on the human genome, they have found 16 different genes that may or may not cause autism. Now, the 16 different genes translates into hundreds of thousands of different possible combinations where one might be turned on and cause it, versus you might need 5 to turn it on and cause it. It's a lot. But just know that autism is genetic.